Been a dream for years. And I finally got it. It's time to make over 1,000 horsepower, and I am freaking stoked! Forged crankshaft, forged rods, forged pistons, insane amount of bottom end parts here. We're looking at 700 horsepower bottom end for one engine, and I am going to conservatively put it to around 600 and just enjoy this insane car as one with two engines at 600 horsepower, making probably around 1,200 horsepower. It's got a split crankcase design. So the crank is literally got a cradle on the bottom of the engine holding it in, and it will hold an insane amount of power. And nitrous piston rings. All the rotational assembly in front of me has been balanced, and it is going to rev to the moon. As there is numbers on all the pistons, and they are the exact same numbers, and it's because they've been balanced, they've been dialed right in, so when that engine is spinning up to 8 grand, it's just gonna be singing. Everything's 100% clean, ready to go, and I'm gonna put this bottom end in. I'm just gonna start with the crank, and then I'm gonna put the pistons and rods in. Thank you Flatlander Performance for partially sponsoring my pistons. Got 2 sets, so I got 12 of them. Thank you so much. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put the bearings into the upper part of the actual block, and I'm going to also install my thrust washers as well. As you can see, this race bearing has a groove. The groove goes into the upper part of the block, and that is so the oil can disperse itself within the crankshaft, and it can spread it around when it's in the journal. The fourth bearing is actually quite a bit wider, and that is normal. That's how it's supposed to go. Bearings are all in the actual block, and now I'm gonna do the lower part of the block and put the bearings in there. And the bottom bearings do not have a groove in the center, just like those. Now I've got to check to make sure that these are all level, and that is very important. This is by far the most difficult part. This is where the thrust washers go, and they need to have the oil groove facing out so it can lubricate the shaft, and it's important to have your engine stand perfectly level. I've already done so. And I say again, make sure the oil grooves are out because you're literally going to screw yourself over. Now it's time for me to use assembly lube on my bearings, and I'm going to make sure I get them on the face of the bearing and not underneath the bearing. That's how they spin. Get some in there, very, very neat and tidy, and I'll show you exactly how I'm gonna do that. I'm just going to go very carefully all the way up, and then I'm going to use my pinky finger and just spread it around just to change the color on the bearing fully. You can't have any spots that aren't actually covered, and then after it's fully covered, you know you're good to go and you're not going to damage your engine on the first startup. Now it's time to drop in my fully clean crankshaft. Beautiful, the crankshaft is in and it is looking good. So what I'm looking at now is the thrust bearings right there and right there, and making sure they're level, and then I can actually move forward. Now I've got to carefully install these thrust washers on top of the crank while it's sitting there, so I've got to drop these in. Got to make sure that groove is pointing out. I'm gonna put a little bit of assembly lube in there so it'll hold it up, because as you can see, gravity is not being my friend right now. So I'm going to just put some in there so it'll hold and make sure they're squared. This is actually That little tab is going to go into this part on the bottom end of the actual engine block. So what I've got to do is make sure they get in there, and that is extremely important. But before I actually install the bottom end of my engine, I have to add RTV to the bottom of the engine. There is little grooves, put the RTV in there, and then it can all go together, and then the bolts can be thrown in. I've got my bolts all organized. There is 4, which is A, then there's 1, which is B, and then there's these ones that go all the way around, and that I will explain later. This bottom end is intense bolting it together. Got the bottom end on, it's looking amazing. So there's a couple things I gotta look for, and one is that is the top of the thrust washer, and it needs to go inside that groove or it will spin and destroy your engine. Same with this side, on the inside of the engine. You can turn the crankshaft and you can actually see in there, and as you can see, it's in that groove. So this is good to go. Now I can put the bolts in. I'm gonna say this once, so pay attention. A goes in here, so there's 2 A bolts, they go here. And then there's 6 B bolts, they go here, and then there's C, and then they go around the entire assembly. So I got one of these Jim Bobs here, and I'm gonna fill this thing up with oil, and I'm going to dunk all the bolts into here before I actually put them into the bottom end, and that will make sure that the threads are all lubed up for torquing. The ones with 4 on it are A, ones with 1 on it are B, and then the ones that are blank are C. I've got everything seated, and I've checked and made sure everything's starting to come together across the dowels and everything, so that's all good. So what I'm going to do is torque them up. I'm just going to be torquing the center ones. So this is A, this is B, so I'm gonna do A and B. 2 19 foot-pounds of torque first. So I've got A and B all done to 19 foot-pounds, and now I'm going to do C, which is the outside ones, up to 15 pounds. Getting there. Now what I've got to do is I've got to do a very, very odd torque pattern. So what I've got to do is I have to torque to yield. And as you can see on the bolts, there's a little tick there, and then a little tick there. So what I have to do is I have to make a mark on the actual bottom of the block down there, and then I torque the first line to the second line that I made from there. And that needs done on all the bolts 2 times. So what I've Jimmy Bobbed here is I've gotten a flathead screwdriver and made little marks where the actual mark is on the bolt. So then when I turn this to the right, I know exactly where that mark has to meet up with that line on the bolt, and I'll be good to go. And then I'm going to have to remark the block after I torque them all 1 time to each line. So as you can see here, I turned it to the next tick. So what I've got to do is then mark again on that one, and then move that line back to over there. But follow the torque pattern and do this a second time. Then I can install my last bolts, and then the bottom end is fully bolted together. This is an easy way to check also if you got them all, and if it's done, it's done. It's simple as that. Most of the bolts in, I've got a few more downtown to go, and I'm gonna check and see if it's gonna turn, if the engine is actually gonna turn. If this doesn't turn, that's very, very bad. Honestly, like, I don't know why it's not turning. Like, it's locked solid. I hope the other end is actually like locked on something. Just kidding. So there's one more step, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So yeah, these ones get torqued to 14 foot-pounds of torque, and I wouldn't go any more than that because it'll actually strip them. Ask me how I know that. The bottom end is completely together other than the oil pump and the oil pan. So that is sick. So what I'm gonna do is spin this around and then I'm gonna start putting the pistons in. Mounted a third plate onto here because now the engine's completely done. I only had 2 in there before. So I literally, this is all I gotta say. It's kind of sketchy. So I've got my lovely pistons and rods all here balanced, ready to go. The only thing I have to do is I have to gap my rings. And these rings are for nitrous, and I am going to put a fairly large gap on them because I'm going to be beating the living piss out of this thing, and I am not ashamed to admit it. The gap I chose to run on the top ring is 23 thou 0.1. And on the second ring, I'm gonna run 25 thou. And the way I figured out the ring gap I was choosing is I used the actual cylinder width and then I multiplied it by this number here, and then that is what gave me the gap. And it's different for the actual second ring, which is here. And that's exactly how I figured mine out, and it's gonna be working great for me. I brake cleaned all these cylinders before, so now I need to re-oil them. So I'm gonna finger bang them real quick. It's a technical term, and basically you just get your fingers in there and bang it in, and you'll be good to go. Make sure she's all lubed up before you put the pistons in and rings and everything. This is important. Here's my top compression ring for my cylinder 1. So I'm going to compress it by hand just by pinching this here and shoving it in and spinning it. So I've spun it, and I have to square it up to the cylinder, so I'm gonna shove a piston in. So I got a stock piston here without any rings in it, and I brake cleaned it, and I'm going to just push it in until the actual skirt meets the cylinder. And I'm gonna check that gap right there. So that's the gap I'm talking about for doing 24 thou. I've got my feeler gauge here. They are all different thicknesses from thin to thick, and I'm going to check it. It's probably going to be about 20 thou because I haven't gapped them yet. So this one is 20 thou, as you can see there, and I'm going to shove it in that gap and see what kind of gap I've got here. So I'm shoving it in, and it does fit. So it's actually closer than I expected. I'm gonna try 21 thou and see if it fits, and if it doesn't, it's in between there. So it doesn't fit, so it's in between. So I need to open that gap by 3 thou at least. So what I'm gonna do is get my grinder and grind that. I'm not gonna show you that in this episode. I'm gonna leave that for another one later down the road. First thing first, I'm going to install the oil rings onto the piston, and that is the bottom piece right here that's indented in there. So I'm gonna put them in there. There we go, I got my oil ring on. Now I gotta make sure they're all clocked the correct way, so I'm gonna go through that. Honestly, you can't see that on camera, so I'm just gonna do it myself. All right, I'm gonna put on my second compression ring. This ring technically pulls oil off the cylinder wall so it doesn't burn oil. And I don't know why they call them compression rings, but anyways. And there's a small marking right there, and that is going to face up. And on the second compression ring that I just did, it has to have the ledge facing down. So according to the Weisco ring sheet, I went right down to the nitrous race only because full send. So I've got everything cleaned, all the rings are clocked correctly, and now I need to put the bearings in and grease all the threads on all the rod bolts so they get torqued down perfectly. So I got everything beautifully set up here. This bolt goes in that hole, like that bolt goes in that hole. Everything is correct, and it has to be because each bolt needs to be on the correct side because it's balanced that way. Some of them have notches out of them to reduce weight, and there's a reason because the crank is meant for that rod, that bolt, that position, everything. Here's my piston ring compressor. I'm going to put it on top of the piston, compress it with that little Jim Bob right there. Compress that all down, and then I'm going to put the piston in, and then lightly tap with a hammer on the top and get that piston in there, and then bolt it up from the bottom of the engine. It's all lubed up, ready to go. Got the assembly lube going, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's do this. This is the last time I really screw around with this piston. It's going in. So I'm gonna oil the rings and then spin them all in and get that oil in there. Just back and forth, keep the clock good, ready to go in. Sweet, so I'm going to compress those rings down, and I'm going to just bring this compressor almost to the bottom of the skirt of the piston, and then I'm going to tighten the compressor until it's tight around the piston. Simple as that, but you gotta be careful. Also have to make sure all this is level, because if it's not, it won't go in the cylinder. So what I usually do is I just tighten it up a bit, and then give it taps until it's all parallel with each other, and then give it the last tightens, and then it's ready to go in. It says FWD, that means front wheel drive, but it also means forward. So I'm gonna put that to the front of the engine, which is where the actual harmonic balancer is. Now you can see less light because it's getting covered by pistons. So as you can see way up in there, there's the rod. So now I gotta put the other end, which is this cap on, and put the bolts in the correct position. And this cap has to be in the right position as well, because the left side has a 1 on it and the other side has random gibberish. And the 1 for this piston has to go to the outside of the block. I had to check that and made sure before I put it in. So now I'm just going to go in by hand and snug them up and do the same thing as you would for a head, is go back and forth on the bolts, going back and forth. And as you can see, I got a squirrely bird on here. Squirrely birds are your saving grace on this type of thing, because you don't want to have to move the crank if you don't have to, because you will move the bearing as well. So squirrely birds are your best friend. I gotta torque down all the rods, so I'm going to spin them up to the top. So I'm just gonna start the first and then go throughout the rest, and I'm going to do it in order so I don't forget any, but I'm gonna go through it again just to make sure. And they are getting torqued to 50 pounds of torque. So everything is torqued down, and pistons and rods and everything are in there, so it's looking very good. So I'm just going to cover everything with oil the best I can. Get the crank really, really wet with oil because it was all brake clean before, right? So I don't want anything to rust. All right, they're all in, ready to go. Looking awesome. So I'm gonna put my oil pickup on and my oil pump, and then I'm going to put my oil pan on and just kind of get this all tidied up so it's all sealed and complete. I got my oil pump here and my oil pickup and some bolts for it as well. And the new seals all the way around, so I'm gonna have everything fresh. I've got to press that into my oil pump, and I'm gonna do that right now. Got her all pressed in, she's ready to go. Then on this side, there is a little O-ring that goes into there. This is very difficult because it doesn't ever seem like it's the right size. What I usually do is cover an RTV and then just jam it in there and it'll actually stay. And then RTV all the way around, and then it can go directly onto the engine right here over top of the shaft. Right on, it's starting to look like an engine. I'm gonna put the oil neck on next, so I'm going to put a new gasket on there with slight amount of RTV. That is looking gorgeous. This definitely looks like a brand new engine. So I'm going to put the oil pan on and be done with the bottom end 100%. This is gonna be the nastiest bottom end ever. This is literally built for over 700 horsepower. It's going to be insanity. This is the last part to the bottom end, and it is my water pump. I got a brand new one. Hard work pays off. Look at that beautiful engine. Everything is brand new, top to bottom. Forged crank, forged pistons, forged rods, yada, yada, yada. New water pump. I've never done a new water pump in my life. Everything's clean. This is a crispy setup. So you saw me build this today. I was actually building two. So when I was doing one bottom end, I was doing two. Here's my other one. It's all wrapped up in there. So yeah, I've done two fully built engines. It is going to be wild. Like, I am so excited. You have no idea. It's actually gonna be a reliable engine setup now, and I can't wait. I can run E85, I can run pump fuel, I can run like straight like race fuel. I can run whatever I want. This is such a versatile setup I make. It's lower compression, so I can still run pump fuel. This is great. It looks very, very sexy, and it's gonna be more than enough build for my car. Since I've got two of them, I'm gonna be definitely over 1,000 horsepower. I'm aiming for 1,200 horsepower between the two engines. That is going to be an overpowered chassis, to say the least. Yeah, I've been waiting for this for years. This has been a dream for years, and I finally got it. Hard work does definitely pay off. This is gonna be insane. So if you've watched this long in the video, I really appreciate it. If you haven't joined, definitely join, help out the channel. It definitely helps this stuff out a lot. So I wanted to just kind of give you guys the fill in on what's gone on in the last couple weeks. And obviously I've been building two of these engines, and having the parts readily available, like on the shelf, is so difficult with COVID and stuff. Things take a long time to come in. That has been a big hurdle for me. So I really had a hard time getting these together because I was waiting on a whole bunch of stuff, and it doesn't help when you have like expensive parts that you screw up. So what ended up happening was I gapped all my rings, and I told you I did my top ring to 24 thou and my second ring to 25 thou, and I was grinding these, and these are nitrous rings, so they're super hardened and they're very, very difficult to actually grind down. And I borrowed a tool from a buddy, and I ground down my rings, and I got into a groove of doing 200 actual turns for each ring because I had to bring it down like 20 thou because they were almost touching once I put it into the actual engine. So I did 200, and on the last one that I was doing, I overshot it, and it was way too small, and this is the ring that I made too small, and I had to order a new set of rings. And I was really worried there that it would take a long time, but it did come in. It came in like fairly quickly, but a whole bunch of new things happened to me in the last month. And I'm not gonna disclose that yet because it's very big news, and I'm gonna share it with you once I can actually share it with you, if that makes any sense. So I've been very busy with that, and financially it's just not there right now for me to put. Got a very cool part-time job now, and that's taking up time for my wrenching and everything. So if you guys don't mind, join the channel. It really helps me out. But yeah, these things are really freaking sweet. And we'll see you in the next one. Like, comment, and subscribe, and this car is gonna be nasty.